What's up guys, I'm Ethan Carter and welcome back to the channel. I do a lot of leatherworking projects on my channel and I often get asked how I do the leather stitching. So I thought I'd take a few minutes today and walk you through how I do three of the most common leather stitches: the saddle stitch, the corset stitch, and the baseball stitch. And also when and why I use them and what they're best suited for. Let's get to it. So before I get into the stitches themselves, let me show you how I punched consistent stitching holes, which will be the same process across all three stitches. I start by using a wing divider to score a stitching line, which helps you easily punch stitching holes a consistent distance from the edge. To score the line, place the right side of the wing divider on the outside edge of the piece of leather, and then carefully run the wing divider down the edge of the leather, and the left side will score a consistent line. The next step is to actually punch the stitching holes. To keep my stitching chisels sharp, I use a plastic punch pad, but you could also use a piece of scrap wood. To punch the holes, I recently upgraded to some pricking irons from a company called Cinnabrook's. But for over a year, I used a very inexpensive set off of Amazon, and they worked great. You'll want a few irons with 1 to 2 teeth for punching along curves, and then at least one 6 to 8 tooth iron for long, straight stitching sections. To help lengthen the life of your irons, you'll also want to use a plastic-headed mallet. To start, align the pricking iron's teeth on the stitching line starting at one end. I prefer to work left to right down the line. Once aligned, hammer the pricking irons until they just peek through the other side. To ensure the spacing between each hole stays consistent as I work my way down the line, I always make sure to place the stitching chisel point furthest to the left in the last hole of the previous set of holes I punched. When you get to an end or a corner, make sure that the tooth farthest to the right will still be on the leather. If not, move the pricking irons back a few holes until it is. And that's basically it. Just continue this process until you've made all the stitching holes you desire. Alright, let's start with the saddle stitch, which is probably the most common stitch, and it's used to stitch two pieces of leather together for things like wallets or notebook covers. And it's also a very clean looking stitch, so I use it sometimes just as a decorative stitch. Let me show you. The saddle stitch, simply put, is where you stitch the same thread from the back and the front of the piece into the same hole, creating a consistent stitch pattern on both sides without any gaps. Here's what you'll need: 2 needles, some thread, a pair of scissors, and a thread zap or a lighter. It's also helpful to have a stitching pony that holds the piece of leather so you can use both hands while stitching. But you can also use a wood hand screw clamp or not use anything at all, which I'll show you later as well. To start, thread a needle at each opposite end of a long piece of thread. Then thread one of the needles through the first stitching hole and pull both needles until you have equal lengths of thread on each side. Next, I always start by using the right needle to stitch from the back and then stitch the left needle from the front into the same hole but in front and under the right needle's thread. It can be helpful to open up the hole a bit using the left needle before stitching from the right. Also, to make sure you don't catch the thread that's already in the hole with the left needle, don't pull the right thread all the way through until you've threaded the left side too, and then pull them both tight at the same time. The most important thing for a nice looking saddle stitch is that you pick a sequence of operations and you stick to that. For instance, in this example, I did the right needle first and then the left needle into the same hole in front of the right needle's thread. As I mentioned earlier, you can do this without a stitching pony, like you see me doing here. Just make sure to remember which is the right and left side so you can keep the sequence consistent, and hold the right thread back as you thread the left so that the left needle doesn't snag the thread. And that's it, that's the saddle stitch. Alright, now time for one of my favorite stitches, the corset stitch, and it's used to stitch two edges of leather together, and it's really useful for wrapping things in leather, kind of like this X-Acto knife. And I find myself using it all the time, and it's really, really useful. So let me show you how I do it. For this example, I'm wrapping an X-Acto with leather, using the corset stitch to hold the two edges together. With two needles secured to opposite ends of the same thread, start by stitching through the first two holes twice to create a loop at the top. Next, with the top of whatever you're wrapping pointed at you, take the left needle and stitch down into the next hole on the right and then back up through the hole parallel to that one on the left side. This creates one half of the cross. Then do the same thing with the right needle, only opposite. Down through the hole on the left side and then back up through the parallel hole on the right side, completing the cross, and then pull both threads tight. Then just continue that pattern all the way down, making sure to pull it tight after each cross. To finish it, I stitch a loop across the last two holes just like we did at the start, and then I tie a small knot on each side of that loop. Then cut the thread as close as possible to those knots and use a thread zap or a lighter to singe the extra thread and kind of push the knot into the hole. And there you have it, the corset stitch. Finally, let's talk about the baseball stitch. Just like the corset stitch, it's used to stitch two edges of leather together, but when you do it, it creates this really cool stitching pattern that looks like a baseball. I find that it doesn't pull the leather as tight as the corset stitch, so I generally use it only when I want a decorative baseball pattern. Let me show you how I do it. For the baseball stitch example, I'm again going to be wrapping an X-Acto for demonstration purposes, but both this stitch and the corset stitch are great for wrapping mallet handles or even things like koozies. The start and ending steps are the same as the corset stitch. Secure two needles to opposite ends of the same thread and start by stitching through the first two holes twice to create a loop at the top. Next, with the top of whatever you're wrapping pointed at you, take the right needle and stitch up through the next hole on the left. Then, take the left needle and stitch over and across the right thread and up into the parallel hole on the right side. To pull the stitches tight, I find it actually works best to pull the threads tight across the seam instead of away from it like we did with the corset stitch. Then just follow that pattern in sequence all the way, making sure to pull the stitches tight as you go. To finish it, just like we did with the corset stitch, I stitch a loop across the last two holes just like we did at the start, and then I tie a small knot on each side of that loop. Then, cut the thread as close as possible to those knots and use a thread zap or a lighter to singe the extra thread and kind of push the knot into the hole. And there you have it, the baseball stitch. Alright, thanks for checking out the video, guys. I hope you found the information useful, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, or hit me up on Instagram. I'm on Instagram as Ethan Carter Designs, and I'm always willing to answer questions there. So, until next time, keep making.